We're now joined by Ekwow from the Africa Education Fund, but you have also served as a former Ghanaian Minister for Communications. You've been a minister in many other different roles. You've also been an ambassador to the US. So you've served in many different functions, but now as a chairman of the Education Fund, tell me about your work.
Well, the Africa Education Trust Fund is an opportunity for Africans and supporters of Africa, partners of Africa, to bring their support to a specific area of Africa's development, which is the skills and the knowledge aspect of Africa. We've talked about natural resources. People talk about, the conference today is talking about all of Africa's natural resources, and often people think mostly about mineral wealth, oil and gas and so forth, but not often do people respect the fact that the 1.3 billion Africans that that region of the world have a variety of skills which need to be improved and upskilled in order to be more competitive in the global marketplace. So the job of the Africa Education Trust Fund is to mobilize attention and focus from the global community, including from Africa itself, and partner with interested companies, many of which are represented at this conference, to intervene in specific aspects of Africa's education, all the way from pre-childhood education, all the way through the tertiary level, especially with vocational technical education, where skills development can improve employability of Africans, because there are many African countries that still have 30% and more unemployment or underemployment of the youth.
Absolutely.
And Africa also has the highest population of young people of all the regions of the world.
And some people would say that Africa's greatest asset
Correct.
Is its people.
Absolutely.
And obviously there is big youth unemployment, and we can't sugarcoat this
Correct.
factor. So what you're doing is trying to educate them so that they can get into the workforce.
Correct.
So you've served in many different capacities, as we said, as a previous ambassador to the US, as a minister in Ghana. What is being at a conference like this? How important is it to have an African conference for Africans to tell a different story to the world?
Well, as the participants in this conference have acknowledged, the narrative from Africa has varied over the years. Some people have seen Africa as a dark continent, or a continent that has too many challenges and too many problems, and often the opportunities are not as highly regarded or as appreciated as they should be. So what the Africa Education Trust Fund will aspire to do, and is doing right now, even at this conference, is networking with similarly minded individuals and institutions and companies. So already we've had conversations with the Microsofts and the Warren Buffett organizations and Rockefeller Foundation, all these institutions that are interested in Africa's development. We want to bring them to a table where we can discuss specifics and to see how they can contribute to the program that we are embarking upon. I had the privilege as Minister of Education 25 years ago to establish a Ghana Education Trust Fund, which became a prototype of sorts for many African countries which don't have such institutions, which mobilize resources. In the case of Ghana, 2.5% of the value added tax that goes into the national kitty goes straight into education through this Ghana Education Trust Fund that, by God's grace, I had the privilege of establishing. So that fund alone has mobilized more than $5 billion for Ghana's education over the last 25 years or so. And so we hope that under the Africa Education Trust Fund, we can be doing 10 billion per annum, at least in mobilization for that sector alone. And we're looking for partners to do that.
I mean, that's fantastic. And when you talk about Ghana, it's easier because it's one country.
Correct.
But when you're talking about a Pan-African education fund,
Correct.
What do you find as some of the biggest obstacles or frustrations in trying to bring these countries together?
Well, I wouldn't call them so much frustrations, and fortunately, because I also had the privilege of working for other international organizations. For example, I used to work at the World Bank itself. I also used to work at the African Development Bank. I was actually Director of Communication at African Development Bank. So bilingualism, multiculturalism are actually assets rather than things that should bring Africa backwards. How you mobilize all those resources of Africa and the large talent pool, I think, is the opportunity and not even a difficulty. But simply put, because of the nature of the committee that has been established that I chair, it reflects the regional influences, the gender balances, and the language differentials of Africa. And so all those ingredients are there. And the key is simply to get the partnership. And it's a private sector-led initiative, because I used to be in government, but I'm not in government now. And so with that knowledge of how government works, which I'm bringing to the private sector, and also I'm a private sector operator, I'm a farmer, I own other kinds of businesses, and we're bringing all those private sector initiatives as well, working with the Africa Private Sector Initiative, working with the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, and other Pan-African institutions to bring this up as a new, if you like, kid on the block, but with a great potential and ability to punch well above our weight.
And it's fantastic because you see that when Africa really does come together, you know, like the African Union, you know, it's powerful as a bloc when you can get all these people together. So when you can get everyone educated and working together, fantastic. But let me ask you another question, because you do have this great lens, having worked in government, having worked in private sector, and you having served, you know, in the US and in other institutions. When you educate these people, how can you make sure that you're keeping your talent at home, as opposed to them fleeing Africa and having this brain drain?
Well, there used to be the fear of brain drain, as you're saying, but now we are talking about brain gain. Why? Because no matter where you are in the world, partly because of technology, we are networking brains. So it doesn't matter whether a person, whether it's African or non-African, is working in Japan, Australia, Trinidad and Tobago, Argentina, as long as his brain or her brain can be networked on behalf of Africa, we are in business. And fortunately, I also served at the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization for 8 years as its chief executive, first African in 100 years to get that position. And if you know about the CTO or even the International Telecommunications Union of the United Nations, the CTO is the sister organization which brings the English-speaking countries in Africa together, English-speaking countries of the world, rather, together in one organization. And with that knowledge, the networking part, Microsoft is at this conference, Google at this conference, they are all interested in education. And the brain power of people can be networked, as we are seeing, on all kinds of platforms, in social media, etc. So no matter where you are, if you are a trained African, you've moved to San Francisco, you are in Argentina, you're even in Eskimo land, and you can tap your brain, you can still contribute to African Education Trust Fund through any numerous, virtual learning and distance learning, for example, is well known. Telemedicine, you can operate a person with a team of doctors in 7 countries, operating a patient in Africa, knowledge that is, diffused, coming together. So all those, technology really solves most of these problems.
No, that's great. So what do you think is one of the things that people, investors outside of Africa, most misunderstand about the promise in Africa?
Well, Africa, unfortunately, over the last 500 years has undergone a number of unfortunate situations, starting from the slave trade, and then going to colonialism, and then post-colonial challenges of readjusting ourselves to the realities of the world. And unfortunately, therefore, the news media in the past have tended to focus on the negatives. Having been trained as a journalist myself, I understand that, if a dog bites a man, it's not news, but it's when a man bites a dog that is news. And as they say, bad news sells best or easier than good news. So all those things tend to work against Africa's best interests, because occasional coup d'etat here, natural disasters there. But all countries are now facing natural disasters. Western United States, fire issues, flood here in Europe and all that. So Africa is not the only disaster-prone region of the world.
That's a good point.
We have a greater need, because of the 500 years of subjugation and colonization and all kinds of other impediments that have been put in our way, including the fact that our continent has been divided into 55 countries.
Yeah. When
the United States is one country and therefore can do so many more. You can travel all over the United States. Interstate Commerce Commission allows goods and services to move around. But in Africa, the boundaries that were set up by our colonial masters, which are still in place, interfere and impede some of the work. Europeans have done well by lowering their borders, becoming a European Union, one passport, allows them to do 70% of trade amongst themselves. Africa still does only 15% of its trade with itself, and does 80-90% with the rest of the world. And so that's what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, established in my country, Ghana, as its headquarters, is attempting to change. And don't let me overlook the fact that today is the birthday of Africa's greatest leader, the first president of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, which BBC in a poll in the year 2000, declared him as Africa's most important leader, the greatest African ever lived. Today is his birthday, so I hope that your audience will also appreciate the historical significance of this conference, which in regard to Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and what he also tried to do. He is the one who created what is now the African Union through the African Organization of African Unity.
Which
and
is now part of the G21.
Very good. All those infrastructure things, African Development Bank, these were all part of his vision. And so we are carrying on with that vision, some of us, and we are glad that we are also now open to a whole new range of partnerships. And as we are discussing, globalization and connectivity are now new strengths that will allow Africa to unite in ways that were not imagined before, because Africa is a very creative continent where a whole new raft of innovation is coming up from different parts of the region.
So everything you're talking about sounds so hopeful. The promise is there. We know that Africa is and can be unstoppable. So what do you want to see there? Instead of talking from now until the next time we meet at the Gabi conference this time next year, what concrete change do you want to see happen?
Well, already Africa is doing better than most regions of the world, even by standard global economic growth indicators. 3 to 4% growth in most parts of Africa compared to 1, 2, 3%, even negative growth in some regions of the world. So that potential is there, the growth is coming, but industrialization is also increasing. Africa is already 40% of Africa's exports are manufactured exports. They're not just raw materials as used to be the case, but we can do more. Energy and power tend to be a problem for most African countries.
Because it needs to trickle down to every African and not just a percentage in those countries.
Yes. And power and electricity needs to be expanded. And Ghana, for example, has 88% access to electricity for the average citizen. But many African countries don't have similar access. South Africa, for example, which is a powerhouse of Africa, is suddenly going through blackouts and other kinds of interference with its electricity generation. But solar power, which is God-given, is also a new and obviously more renewable kind of energy. And I happen to also be chairman of an African solar company, SolarFi, which is also trying its best to bring various kinds of solar products and services to the African region. So we shall make it. And we thank all those who are listening to us today and who are willing to be partners of Africa Education Trust Fund. Reach out and we can partner together, and the moon and the skies are not our limits.
I love that. The moon and the skies are not our limits. We will speak about that next year.
Thank you so much.